I mean, Vadim Krasikov, who's this Russian hitman who was being held in prison in Germany, there's a lot of attention on him. Some would say, well, why does Vladimir Putin care so much about just one hitman?
It's not so much about one hitman, because let's face it, Krasikov is unlikely to be taking any more sojourns outside the country, whatever false identity documents they give him. It's rather that if you are expecting people to operate in dangerous situations, and one of the side effects of the fact that so many Russian spies were kicked out of embassies, when they operated, they'd always operated with diplomatic immunity. So if you were caught doing bad stuff, the worst that could really happen is you just kicked out the country. Now, though, without having to rely on them, they're using so-called illegals, people who are under what's called non-official cover. In other words, they're pretending to be business people or tourists or whatever else. When they get caught, they go to prison. And I think this is the key thing. It's that it's not about Krasikov himself. It's about, for the future generations of Krasikovs, they need to be reassured that if you get caught, don't worry. The motherland will not forget you. One way or the other, no matter how many hostages we have to take, we will get you back.
And does that partly explain the way Putin has reacted to this prisoner swap? I mean, in a similar way to Biden and Harris being on the tarmac, welcoming Evan Gershkovich in Maryland last week, you had Vladimir Putin welcoming Vadim Krasikov, giving him a big hug, making a big play of his return.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, the interesting thing is this hasn't actually had massive amounts of coverage in the Russian media. It's not something that they really want to make too big a deal of it, with the exception of a couple of the more sort of tub-thumpingly patriotic tabloids. But the point is, to the audience that matters, in other words, as I say, the next generation of spooks, saboteurs, and assassins, they will absolutely have seen not only that these people were got back, but that they were given a high-profile welcome, and almost certainly that the state will look after them. I'd be surprised if amongst this current batch of spies, we don't have someone else who becomes, I don't know, a parliamentarian, like the assassin who killed Litvinenko in London, or otherwise get some kind of high-profile goodie. It is a way of saying that they will be rewarded as well as saved.
And Putin's tactic of falsely imprisoning foreigners on trumped-up charges, clearly that's something he's been doing for years. Is it a tactic he's been ramping up further in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen this. And on the whole, the foreigners, I mean, there's obviously exceptions like Evan Gershkovich, but the foreigners who have been caught, they tend to actually have made some minor transgression of Russian law. But what Putin ensures is that not just a book, but a whole volume of encyclopedias is thrown at him, so that they end up going to prison in very, I think the usual euphemism is austere circumstances. And that makes them that much more of a hostage for negotiation. So look, we saw in the past, I mean, back in Soviet times, from time to time, there were occasions when individual journalists, tourists or whatever were grabbed precisely for this purpose. But the scale and the blatant way in which it's being done, that is absolutely new and definitely is being ramped up, which makes it also a key thing to note. And I say this as someone who has been banned from Russia, so it wouldn't apply to me anyway. But nonetheless, it is a dangerous time for Westerners to be heading to Russia.
There was a lot of speculation that this deal originally was intended to include Alexei Navalny being released and returned to presumably Germany. Does the fact that obviously he died a few months back in that Russian prison before this deal could be completed suggest that the Putin simply couldn't have stomached that? The Putin's ego couldn't have stomached seeing his arch opponent released?
Yeah, this is a tricky one because, look, there's no question but that Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. The question is whether it was an actual direct killing, kill this guy now, or whether it was just simply that he was put in conditions in which his body, already weakened by the various poisonings at the hand of Putin's agents, actually just could not survive, and he died of natural causes, but in deeply unnatural circumstances. Now, my suspicion is actually it's the latter. And I think in this case, look, Navalny was probably being dangled as a way of trying to get the West to release Krasikov, because that was clearly Putin's primary objective. Whether he ultimately would have gone ahead with that swap, I don't know. A classic Russian approach is the bait and switch, that you start the negotiations by offering something good to get the other side engaged and excited by the prospect. And then at the last minute you say, no, for whatever reasons, we can't actually also swap Navalny. But I'll tell you what, we can still go ahead with the deal. Or do you want to call the whole thing off and then it's going to be on your head? So look, I mean, it's very hard to tell, but I suspect that one way or the other, Putin would not have been letting Navalny out again, precisely because of the degree to which Navalny was both dangerous and also had clearly got under Putin's skin.
Does the prisoner swap have any significance for the war in Ukraine, Mark?
It may prove to on a very minor scale, in the sense of the fact that it actually was able to be successfully negotiated was indeed a reminder that you don't actually have to like or trust the other side to be able to make deals which are in a common interest. So on some very small scale, some people are calling it a trust building exercise. Now, I don't think, unfortunately, that we should be putting too much faith in that. It all depends on what happens now. But the Russians are certainly not giving any sign that they plan to build off this into anything wider. So, look, it could prove someday in the future that the kind of channels of communication which were used to negotiate this could be used for some other purpose. But as I say, no evidence at the moment.
Donald Trump reacted to the deal by implying that it was somehow a bad deal. What is your response to that?
Well, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, any deal that he negotiates is a good deal and any other deal is a bad deal. So we have to understand this. Look, I mean, there is no way of getting around the fact that this is also a political advantage to Joe Biden, which is why, presumably, Trump is reacting the way he is. And it's also interesting that the Russians did not hold off. It's not like they decided, well, let's see if Trump gets elected, then maybe we can do the deal then to give him an extra little boost. I think it is clear that from their point of view, they, A, have no idea what's going to happen in American politics, like the rest of us, and B, ultimately, they don't entirely trust Trump to actually come through with what he promises. So I think from their point of view, fine, let Biden have the momentary limelight. They just want to get the deal sorted.
I want to come back to US politics and its significance for Vladimir Putin in a moment. But I mean, just to play devil's advocate, and I'm not for one moment suggesting it was a bad deal because, look, here at the Times, Evan Gershkovich is one of our colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. But that you could make an argument that by reaching these kind of prisoner return agreements, you are furthering Putin's business model, as it were, which is that you falsely imprison foreigners on trumped-up charges in return for some very nasty people being released who had been imprisoned legitimately in the West. Is there an argument to be made there?
Yeah, sadly there is. Look, again, like you, I'm delighted for all of these people, especially actually, I would say, including the dissidents, many of whom really were under the Western radar in many ways, who have now been sort of brought out from behind the razor wire. On the other hand, if we look at it rather more bloodlessly in terms of sort of diplomatic and geopolitical strategy, it's not only that it sort of empowers Putin to think that he can get away with bad stuff, it also plays, unfortunately, to his view that when it comes down to it, we in the West are lacking in resolution, that no matter what tough rhetoric we may be saying today, we'll be willing to make a deal tomorrow. And that essentially Russia's secret weapon is its will, is, to put it another way, its ruthlessness. So in this respect, unfortunately, although, as I say, I'm delighted by the deal, but on the other hand, there is a degree to which it does empower Putin, and we have to recognize this. And I think it's a good deal in humanitarian terms, but a bad deal in geopolitical ones.
Let's talk about the US election. How much will Vladimir Putin and his allies in the Kremlin be looking at the election race and be increasingly concerned by Kamala Harris's rising poll numbers?
They clearly are unsettled by that. I mean, I think they did at a certain point feel that the election was in the bag for Trump. And although we shouldn't overplay the degree to which Trump is not Putin's man or anything like that, if we look at his first presidency, or maybe his only presidency, we'll have to wait and see, actually, American policy towards Russia was tougher at the end of it than it had been at any point since 1991. And so there's no real belief in Trump. But on the other hand, Trump is the grand disruptor. And if there's one thing that Russian policy towards the United States and the West in general is, it is about disruption. It is about trying to break apart the bonds of alliance and common sort of purpose, which at the moment supporting the sanctions regime, the continued support for Ukraine and so forth. But I think there is also a degree to which the Russians, whether it's just they're simply trying to look for a silver lining, but are seeing this as a bit of a win-win. If Trump wins, then we can imagine a certain isolationist turn within American foreign policy, much more Ukraine skeptical, much actually more European skeptical. A good thing for Moscow. On the other hand, if Trump loses, especially if it's a close election race, then there is this assumption that basically there will be a period of massive disruption within the United States. Disruption, which of course the Russians will do everything they can to amplify. Not that they actually have much impact, but nonetheless, they will do their bit. So again, there will be that sense that America will be disrupted, even if Trump loses. So obviously, the Russians are watching this very, very carefully. But from their point of view, they don't necessarily care quite so much about who gets elected president. They care much more about the essential health and functionality of the American system overall. And that really is clearly in a bit of a crisis.
It's a really good point about their modus operandi to spread disruption and division in societies rather than get one particular political outcome. I mean, on that note, we saw a couple of weeks ago the arson attack on the French rail network on the day of the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics, and there's been a lot of speculation as to potential Russian involvement. What is your take on that, Mark?
Well, so far, the French security and intelligence services are actually playing down the notion of any Russian involvement. And given the degree to which the Olympics is quite central at the moment to their sense of self-image and so forth, I don't think that they would be going quietly if they did think Moscow's hand was there. But again, I think what's really interesting is clearly the Russians are carrying out this kind of attack. It's very hard to say at the moment whether they're behind this particular one. But the very fact that there is this suspicion, I mean, part of what Putin is trying to do with this campaign is not just simply genuinely disrupt the West and more or less say to the West, you think this war has no real consequences for you, that you can just write a check every month to help the Ukrainians and the war happens somewhere else. Well, no, this war is going to have implications for you, whether it's in terms of unexplained fires in your shopping centers or disrupting your transport network. But the very fact that we're talking about, is this Russia, means we are actually doing precisely what Putin would like. We are building him up as a threat. And this is the terrible dilemma in which we're in. We have to recognize the real threat. We can't pretend that Putin isn't doing these things. But on the other hand, if we see Putin's hand behind everything that happens, then the risk is actually we make him seem far more powerful than he really is. We just have to try and find that middle line between the two.
How will Putin be viewing events on the front line in Ukraine at the moment? I mean, Russia have made incremental gains throughout their summer offensive, but maybe not to the extent that they would have hoped earlier in the year, given the issues that Ukraine has had with its own mobilization and also delays in Western military aid. And the Russian casualty rate is still extremely high. How will he be viewing the situation?
And obviously, it's very difficult to try and kind of crawl into the dark recesses of Putin's own perceptions, especially because we don't really know just how honest and accurate the reporting that he's getting from his own people is. But generally speaking, I mean, what is clear is that, yes, the Russians have made advances through the year and continue to make advances and probably will continue. But then that was always going to be the case. This was always going to be the year when in some ways the Russians had the whip hand. They had more personnel to throw in. They had more artillery ammunition to be able to use. And the Ukrainians didn't yet have, for example, the F-16 fighters, which are just now beginning to come into service and so forth. So the issue is exactly not were they going to make advances, but were they going to make sufficient advances? And I think when it comes down to it, I think that there will be a degree of dissatisfaction. Pleasure that they have made further moves. They certainly are closing in on this key city or town of Chasiv Yar, but dissatisfaction that they haven't done enough, because next year almost certainly it will be the Ukrainians who will have the initiative, and we'll see a Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so the question is that the Russians, can they hold on to what they've gained? But the bottom line is the Russians are nowhere near being able to impose the kind of political solution that they would like on Ukraine. Taking a village here, taking another square kilometer there, it matters for those people who are sort of tallying this almost like a sporting event on a sort of day-by-day, week-by-week basis. But in wider terms, in terms of the capacity to actually bring an end to this war, that suits Moscow. this is not really having any major effect. And as you say, the casualty figures, I think, are the crucial thing, because at the same time as the Russians are burning through personnel, we're also seeing that they're actually having more and more trouble actually recruiting people at home. They're having to offer more and more money, to be blunt. So at some point, the discrepancy between the two will become a real problem.
And just on that, Mark, just finally, do you think Putin is prepared to go to more extreme lengths when it comes to mobilization?
It's interesting that he has held back from the politically problematic sort of options, which are either another mobilization wave, and we saw just how disruptive the first one was, where for every soldier he managed to get to the front lines, 2 to 3 Russians fled the country, or else using conscripts. I mean, up to now, he's held back from using these 18 to 21-year-olds doing their national service because, again, he knows that would have a massive impact on the home front. So these are options that are at his disposal, absolutely. The thing is, for now, it's almost too late for this year. Because even if he calls a mobilization wave tomorrow, it will take probably 6 to 8 weeks before the soldiers could potentially be available for fighting. And by that point, the summer campaigning season is beginning to slightly sort of ramp down. But actually also the political costs get greater over time. And therefore, again, I mean, yes, if he absolutely feels that his back is to the wall, he will turn to these. But I think actually he's also increasingly worried about just how the Russian population will respond if he starts throwing that, not volunteers, but recruits and raised reservists into the battle.
I think what is happening is that Ukraine is exercising what we call in doctrinal terms sea denial. They're severely constricting where the Russians can go, from where they can launch their missiles, for example, against land targets in Ukraine. They've certainly been able to deter any sort of amphibious operations by the Russians in the Western Black Sea. And of course, in the early days, you'll remember that the citizens of Odessa could actually see Russian amphibious ships just on the horizon. That's how close they were. And after the Moskva, of course, was hit by the indigenously produced anti-ship missiles, the Neptunes, that rather pushed the Russians back a bit. Then they had their Sea Baby surface drones, which carry up to a ton of explosive now. And they're out hunting Russian ships, both warships and merchant ships. And they've essentially pushed the Russian surface fleet into Novorossiysk, which is well to the east of what they would call the combat zone. And they're making life in Sevastopol in Crimea increasingly untenable. And as you mentioned, they struck and sank the Rostov-on-Don, this Kilo-class submarine. Now, they've already had a go at the Rostov-on-Don before. It had a huge hole in it when it was in dry dock. The Russians have obviously tried to repair it, got it back on the water again, and it's been hit by what I think is an ATACMS missile, one of these advanced American ballistic missiles that can be really accurately targeted by satellite or by drone. So cumulatively, with the anti-ship missiles, the addition of ATACMS, the use of both air and surface drones, they've made life pretty untenable for the Russians in the Black Sea.
I mean, Ukraine targeting the Black Sea Fleet is nothing new, but it does raise the question, why has Russia not been able to better defend it, especially given we're talking about Ukraine here, which is a country without much of a navy at all to speak of?
Yeah, what we have to remember, James, is that, a maritime capability is not just what you can put to sea. It's the sort of air units, aircraft in particular. It's missiles. It's everything you can launch from land, and that's included drones and these surface-based drones as well. What's going to be significant, of course, is when the F16s arrive, because they can carry a variety of munitions, some of which are fire and forget. Others have to be sort of locked onto by the F-16's radar, then guided to their targets. But that's going to give them a massive uplift in capability to actually drive the Russians even further away. The problem for the Russians, of course, is they can't reinforce their Black Sea fleet from outside because the Montreux Convention in 1930 says you're not allowed to actually pass warships of belligerents through the Dardanelles and up past Istanbul. So they can't actually put more warships in there. And significantly, the Russians just had a big global exercise, and the one fleet that hasn't been able to take part in that out of the Baltic, the Pacific, and the Northern Fleet has been the Black Sea Fleet. They've been notable by their absence. The other big success, of course, that the Ukrainians have had is they've been able to open up this protected route for their exports, particularly grain exports on the western side of the Black Sea. And essentially that goes through territorial waters of Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, so NATO countries. Russians would be very unwise to attack shipping in the territorial seas of those countries. And the last bit is heavily mined by the Ukrainians as it approaches the territorial seas of Moldova and goes into Odessa as well. So there's also a very successful story there, and Russian warships aren't able to approach and target that.
And Ukraine has obviously had a lot of success targeting Russian air defences in Crimea. It says only the other day they destroyed 4 Russian S-400 air defence systems. Between the degrading of the Black Sea Fleet and the targeting of Russian air defences in Crimea, how vulnerable is the peninsula, which of course is occupied by Russia, to an attack by Ukraine now?
Yeah, it's very vulnerable, James. The fact of life is that it relies exclusively for its water on water coming down from the Dnieper River. Now, the Ukrainians have cut that off, and almost all the supplies that the Russians want to get into Crimea, they have to either take through the bits they've occupied, the land bridge, as they call it, in the east of Ukraine. That's the Donbass and other regions there, Zaporizhzhia, that sits right on top of Crimea, or they have to take it across the Kerch Bridge. And as you say, the Kerch Bridge is coming under increased surveillance and I think soon attack by the Ukrainians. As you say, they've taken out some S-400 launchers. That's quite an advanced missile system. There was a rumor this week they'd taken out an S-500 missile system, which we haven't seen used in anger yet. But if that's the case, then the Russians are going to be smarting after that, to tell you the truth. But it looks like the Ukrainians are trying to probe and take out the air defences of the Kerch Bridge area before they take it out with something else. I suspect an ATACMS or two will hit it.
And were the Kerch Bridge to be destroyed or rendered effectively useless, how significant a moment would that be? What would that mean both symbolically but also operationally for the Russians?
Yeah, symbolically, obviously, it's going to mean a lot, and the Russians are putting a lot into defending it. What it means is that their logistic chains coming through the occupied oblasts, occupied provinces in the south and east of Ukraine are going to come under absolutely more pressure from long-range strikes from the Ukrainians, both by drone and by these ATACMS missiles, which got a range of between 170, 190 miles, so quite significant. Their ballistic missiles are very hard to intercept and got a very good explosive power on the other end, whether it's a single warhead or bomblets that are contained in a multiple warhead.
Let's talk about the F-16s. President Zelensky has confirmed that the first F-16s have now been delivered to Ukraine. How much of a difference do you think they'll make to the wider war?
I think the difference they'll make, they're going to have to be used sparingly. I think if you look at what Ukraine really needs, they probably need about 140, 150 F-16s to make a difference. I think they're going to have to use them sparingly, both to support their existing aircraft, which are mostly MiG-29s, to enable them to survive. You've got advanced avionics, you've got better radar, you've got a whole range of munitions that can go under the wings of the F-16. It's a wonderful aircraft in that respect. It's very high performance. I should think that the Russians will be hunting them from day one with some of their more advanced fighters, to tell you the truth, to try and take them out of the game. But the fact of life is there are thousands of F-16s around the world. One of the attractions of having F-16s is that quite a lot of countries can donate them if they want to. And some of the most advanced variants are more than a match for some of the Russian fighters that we've seen deployed in Ukraine at the moment. So it's going to make a difference. They're going to have to be used sparingly. They're going to have to be protected, but expect to see them probably launching munitions against both land and sea targets over the next few months.
It's interesting you say, Chris, they probably need 140, 150 to make a real difference. I think Zelensky said they need about 130, but, certainly a lot more than they'll have to begin with. Is there any prospect of Ukraine ending up with that number in 6 months, a year's time?
Yeah, it's possible. I think we've got to be realistic and say they're going to lose some of them. And of course, as in the Battle of Britain, it's not so much the number of aircraft that you can produce; it's the number of pilots that can actually fly them as well. And I suspect they've probably got more aircraft than pilots that can fly them at the moment, and that's going to be continuing to be the case. So, preserving the aircrew for those aircraft is going to be very important indeed. So, as I said, use them sparingly, use them for high priority and high importance targets. Don't spread them across the battlefield, would be my advice.
And preserving the aircraft themselves, of course, will be a huge thing. Presumably, Russia will be targeting Ukrainian air bases, looking for the F-16s. If you're Ukraine, how can you mitigate that risk?
Well, what you do, I mean, the other thing, James, of course, is we've got sort of maintainers have to be preserved as well. These are new aircraft, although we've seen the Ukrainians are very adaptable and very resourceful. So don't be surprised if you see quite a lot of old kit being strapped onto the F-16s and been made to work as well. So what they'll do is they'll obviously camouflage them. They'll try and reduce the signature. They'll try and stop the Russians being able to track them back to their bases. And when they are in and around their bases, they'll try and disperse them. You won't put them all together in one place. One of the beauties, of course, of the F-35 and previously the Harrier is you could actually put it out in very austere places and it could operate almost from fields. In fact, in the Falklands, the Harrier did operate from fields and was able to do that. So they'll have to disperse them. They'll have to disguise, camouflage them, and be very careful about their physical and electronic signature when they're flying around and returning to base.
There was a very interesting piece in the Times this week by George Grills, the Times defence correspondent. He's just returned from Romania, where he'd visited what will soon be NATO's biggest air base in Europe. What is the significance of NATO expanding that base not far from the border with Russia?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of reasons for being in that part of the world. NATO needs to concentrate there in the same way it needs to concentrate around the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They come under frequent threat from Russia. There's quite a lot of surveillance, a lot of electronic interference, jamming of GPS. Romania and Bulgaria need to be reassured that obviously NATO is looking out for them, and there's no better way of doing that than putting NATO forces in those countries, and that's part of it. Secondly, it enables the basing of aircraft and other air systems that can conduct surveillance of the Ukrainian theatre. And if it all goes wrong around Odessa and the Russians get their way in Moldova, for example, it gives us an excellent opportunity not only to survey the land area, but also the broader Black Sea region into Crimea and places like that. And if obviously the Russians decide to escalate anything, we're prepared. We're operating in the local environment. We're familiar with the territory and the airspace, and we can react accordingly.
What is your take, Chris, on the rate of Russian casualties we're seeing at the moment? There was an intelligence report recently from the British MOD, Ministry of Defence, saying they estimate Russia will have around 1,000 casualties per day throughout the month of August. Is that sustainable?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was listening to a speech by a Russian general to some staff officers about 3 months ago, and he was asked, are we going to win in Ukraine? And he, of course, said, yes, we are. And he said, well, what's the plan, General? And the general said, well, we'll just throw corpses at it. And, everybody got up and applauded. I mean, that is the Russian way. They don't actually think of casualties in the same way that we do. And it is extraordinary the extent to which the Russian people can take these casualties without actually saying, well, this is not really in the interest of the motherland that we're losing all these people. I think that to an extent the losses are being disguised in Russia. Quite a lot of the soldiers are coming from, shall we say, the edges of society, particularly from those parts of the Russian Federation that are not very visible. Not many people from St. Petersburg, Moscow, and places like that. what I've heard is, they've suffered up to 800,000 casualties, both killed and severely wounded, which is quite phenomenal when you think about it. That's just under 0.8% of the population, which is pretty unsustainable. But the Russians are in for the long haul. They've got immense financial resources based on their energy sales. They've got the ability now to import weapons from China, Russia, and other friendly countries, and we're seeing quite a lot of arms transfers now. I've even seen Pakistan saying they'll contribute Shahed missiles, ballistic missiles, to Iran. Well, if they give them to Iran, they're going to end up in Russia at some stage. So we've got to understand that in this new world of ours, that a country's capacity is not limited by what itself can produce, either in manpower or in terms of materiel. We have spoken many times, James, on the fact that the world is split into two blocks now: the Eurasian autocrats of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and the maritime democracies, which are predominantly NATO, United States, obviously, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, and probably India moving towards that in the future. But the fact of life is these two blocks are moving weapons, expertise, intelligence around between each other all the time, depending on where they're focused in the world. So, behind Russia at the moment, you've got China, Iran, and North Korea. And if they can get away with it, they're supplying arms, weapons, expertise, and intelligence all at once.
And just to go back to the point about the Russian casualty rates, I absolutely hear what you say, Chris. It is historically fact that Russia has long had a different attitude to the sacrificing of human life. But even though at the moment a lot of the troops fighting on the front line in Ukraine for Russia are migrants or convicts, have not had much training, and not, as you say, are people on the fringes of Russian society, surely there is a finite supply of such troops. And is Vladimir Putin prepared to take the political risk of, for example, calling up 18 to 21-year-olds who are doing their national service, who are, if you want, good middle-class Russian boys, the sons of people living in the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg? Isn't that the big risk for Putin?
Well, I think that's the dividing line. As you know, James, I think most of the listeners know that nearly 3 million Russians are abroad at the moment trying to avoid that draft. So quite a lot of people living outside Russia. The problem is, until you actually make people in St. Petersburg and Moscow feel the pain, it's not going to count. The sole criterion in Russia for policy making decisions is regime survival, and they will do anything to survive. Right now, if you're Vladimir Putin, you're saying, look, I've nearly captured 4 Ukrainian provinces here. It's part of Mother Russia again. And, even if I come to terms at the end of this year, which I think is a possibility, we can always wait till next year, and then we'll grab Odessa and Moldova, and we'll have cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. That's what I wanted to achieve in the first place. In fact, on the first day of the war, the 24th of February 2022, I actually talked to the Chief of Defence Staff, Admiral Tony Radakin, and I said, you do realise they're not after the whole of Ukraine, they just want the bottom third, because that is the old new Russia under Catherine the Great. And the reason I knew that is because Putin was giving speeches in front of statues of Catherine the Great, and every Russian knew what that meant, even if people in the West didn't pick it up. So it was always the case, I think, that he was wanting to do that. Obviously, decapitate the government in Kiev, and also make it more of a dependent satellite. But in terms of territorial acquisition, he wanted that bottom third.
And just finally, Chris, on the point about mobilization and manpower, where do you think Ukraine are with that at the moment?
Well, Ukraine is struggling. They've only got a population of 42 million, which is, about a quarter of that of Russia. And the number of people who can actually fight in the front line is limited. So they're having to, it's very much like the British Army in World War II. You couldn't actually sacrifice vast numbers of troops in battles because we didn't have the demographics for it. It's the same with Ukraine. So Ukraine's trying to use quite a lot of technology, a lot of expertise to try and supplement its meager manpower. At the end of the day, Ukraine is going to have to pick its battles where it commits its manpower. We've seen all through this year the Russians trying to probe to see where they can suck in that manpower and destroy it. That actually hasn't happened because the Ukrainians have been smart. My own instinct is that once this campaigning season is over, I think we're going to see moves from both sides to try and settle something by way of an armistice. I don't think we're ever going to see a complete peace at the moment because both sides' aspirations are still outstanding. There isn't the basis for negotiation on a permanent basis, but I think there'll be some sort of ceasefire armistice by the end of the year. They'll want to draw breath, see what's going on. Russia, frankly, could declare victory now by holding those 4 provinces and Crimea. Oddly enough, I think Crimea is the least tenable of the parts of Ukraine that Russia holds right now. If I'm a betting man, I think the Russians will end up with the 2 eastern provinces, the ones that are most heavily populated by Russians. They could lose the Crimea. But when I talk to Russians, it's almost as if it's over our dead body we're going to lose Crimea. There's something very totemic, very symbolic about holding Crimea. And of course, the sovereign base at Sevastopol. They wouldn't be able to replace Sevastopol overnight if they lost Crimea.
Let's come on to the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I suppose, first of all, Bill, do you think there's any significance in terms of the prisoner agreement on the war in Ukraine?
I don't think it has any real impact on the war in Ukraine. I mean, I think that the war in Ukraine is going on and it will continue to go on. Putin needs this war in order to stay sort of firmly in power. He needs to show everybody that he's a strong man, and this war does that for him. The Ukrainians are not going to give up territory nor give up in any way, because if they do, we know the brutality and the murder and rape and other terrible things that they do in occupied Ukraine. And so right now what you have is both sides firmly dug in, and there's no end to this war in sight, in my opinion.
I mean, I asked that because I've heard 1 or 2 people suggest that somehow the prisoner agreement may show that negotiations are possible between Russia and the West when it comes to Ukraine. The problem, I suppose, with that is most of the people who are suggesting negotiations are implicitly saying that would involve Ukraine ceding sovereign territory.
Well, there are no negotiations. I mean, the only negotiation that should be had is a withdrawal agreement from Ukraine. If Russia agrees to withdraw their troops from Ukrainian sovereign territory, then the negotiation should be, and under what conditions they withdraw their troops. Any other negotiation doesn't make any sense. I mean, Russia invaded. Russia should withdraw. There's no anybody suggesting otherwise is just suggesting capitulation, and capitulation and appeasement only leads to, other terrible things. Putin doesn't view compromise and weakness as a way of de-escalating. He gets more excited and more enraged and more aggressive when he sees weakness.
Let's talk about a major development over the past few days, which is a Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. If you're Vladimir Putin sitting in the Kremlin, is that what really concerns you when the war physically comes to Russian territory?
I think this is a dramatic development and something which both symbolically and militarily really has huge implications. Symbolically, this makes Putin look weak. It makes him look like he can't. He started what he described as a special military operation. He even prosecuted people who called it a war. If you called this thing a war, you would sentence to jail to 8 years. So this special military operation, the purpose of calling it that was to make it seem like it's something far away, very defined, not affecting the Russian people. And all of a sudden, a piece of Russia has been annexed by Ukraine. And I may be going a little ahead of myself. It's only a few tens of kilometers, but the symbolism of that is extreme, because now how does Putin characterize this in this own sort of hermetically sealed special military operation? This is a war that he started, which is now bitten off a piece of Russia. And depending on how this plays itself out and how long they can hold the territory, can they get more territory, it's even more humiliating for Putin. The other thing it does is it means that Russia has to sort of reevaluate where they're allocating their limited resources. And of course, Russia is a much bigger country than Ukraine. They've got many more troops and much more equipment. But all of a sudden, now that if they don't do something to stop this advance, which means pulling people out of aggressing in Ukraine, it could get worse for them. And so this has a lot of implications. I think it's worth watching very closely over the next days and weeks. And as somebody who supports Ukraine wholeheartedly, I'm very excited and encouraged by this new development, and I think it shows the creativity and the genius of the Ukrainian military commanders.
The point about where Russia allocates resources is a really critical one. And there have been reports in recent weeks even that Putin has asked for air defenses to be transferred away from Ukraine into Russia to look after his presidential palaces in Moscow and in Sochi. What do you make of that, Bill?
Well, what it shows is that Ukraine's drone strategy, that Ukraine's grinding down of Russia's equipment all over the place is working. It's Ukraine is a total underdog, but they're a very effective underdog. They have used what limited tools they have to the maximum advantage to harm Russia and to harm Putin. And everybody thought this war was going to be over in 3 days, and now we're 2.5 years into it, and Russia is suffering, and of course Ukraine has suffered profoundly, and nothing can take that away. But Russia is suffering as well, and they, in addition to them moving air defenses away from Ukraine to protect Putin's palaces, Russia has lost 500,000. I think the number is going close to 600,000 soldiers, according to Ukrainian estimates. I mean, 1,000 a day. And just to put this in perspective, the entire Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, over a 10-year period, they lost 15,000 soldiers. They've lost 600,000 now, or 580,000, or whatever the accurate number is, but a huge, huge number. And that's unbelievable. I mean, it's shocking. It's beyond comprehension, the amount of death, destruction, and disability that Putin has inflicted on his own people.
I suppose that does raise the question, though. Why is Putin not paying the political price at home for the casualty rate that the Soviets did for the casualty rate in Afghanistan?
Because he's running an absolute dictatorship. And maybe it was a dictatorship before, but it's a much more pernicious dictatorship right now, where if you're a mother who's lost a child and you say something bad about that, you end up losing your pension, maybe losing your apartment, maybe even going to jail. And so everybody is just sitting in absolute terror and fear and heartbreak about what's happened, and there's nothing they can do about it. And there is Putin has sort of reallocated the pain towards the least politically influential people, to the extent that there's any politics. What he's done is he's subjected the poorest, the most minority people in Russia to the death and destruction. So if you're in Buryatia or Ingushetia or some very far away place from Moscow, there's a very high chance that your children or your brother or you yourself are somehow affected by this. If you're in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the wealthy people are, there's a much lower chance. But at the end of the day, everybody is affected by this. It doesn't bypass anybody. And the cemeteries are full in all sorts of places in Moscow by dead people. And sooner or later that has to have an effect. But as long as there is the risk of retaliation by the state, everybody is just keeping quiet.
And do you think, Bill, we might be close to Putin being forced to resort to calling up young men from the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg? And if he does that, is that really the moment of maximum political peril for him?
Well, at the moment right now, what he's doing is he's paying more and more money to pay people to go to fight in the war. And so again, you get the poor people who are ready to do almost anything for money. And so the amount of payment to people to fight in the war has gone up by several 100%, because they're sort of scraping the bottom of the barrel. But eventually they will have to do a conscription. And as they do that conscription, then there is, no matter what, I mean, if you're going to die in war, you have a much better, you're not so worried about protesting, being called off to battle. And so I think that there's, that's why he's trying to avoid it, is he knows that even with his repression, if they do a general conscription in this pointless war, that does put him at some risk of people getting angry and doing stuff.
Dramatic news has broken this week of a Ukrainian invasion into the Kursk region of Russia. What is your understanding of who is part of that attack and what has actually happened?
Well, I mean, there's the usual caveats of that this is something that's developing fairly rapidly, and we're only about 48 hours into this. But it looks like what we have is a reasonably large Ukrainian operation involving forces from at least 2 brigades who have crossed the border into Kursk or Kursk Oblast in Russia, and are now sort of, if you like, spreading out and thus far, they've captured a number of small villages. They appear to be in the outskirts of the town of Sudza, and they've probably captured, or at least there's images of several hundred Russian troops who have been kind of caught up in this as prisoners of war.
President Putin is reported to have held an emergency meeting of his National Security Council, calling this a large-scale provocation. Do we know really how big it is at the moment, though?
I think it's difficult to know the exact size of it because some of this images have been filtering out. But it's, first of all, it looks like the first incursion of this scale using Ukrainian conventional forces into Russia. We've seen some previously from sort of proxies or Ukrainian supported resistance forces, but there are at least 2 brigades here, the 22nd Mechanized and the 82nd Air Assault, where personnel have been identified from footage and from pictures. And it's certainly embarrassing for Russia at the moment. There were some signs in the initial reporting that they had basically said, well, we've got this situation under control, that we have repelled Ukrainian forces. And those messages have all now been deleted from Russian social media. And instead, they're sort of treating this as more of a crisis than an incident.
Major General Mick Ryan, who he often commentates on Frontline, has written an early assessment of the situation, and he talks about this multi-brigade operation with these quality brigades, the 22nd Mechanized Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. I mean, if this is true, and if there are more to come, it's pointing to something quite different, isn't it?
I think potentially. I mean, again, it's difficult to know at the moment what the exact objectives are, and I think it's worth splitting those down into the sort of the military objectives, the tactical objectives, and what could be some significant political and presentational ones. On the ground, there are a number of potential explanations for what this is intended to do. I mean, it could be just an opportunity that opened up to go on to, conduct a counterattack, go on to the offensive, capture some prisoners of war for a later prisoner exchange. It could be linked to operations that are going on elsewhere that we don't know about or that are about to be launched. So, for example, there is some suggestion that there are lines of communication and supply lines that are going to the Russian forces that are on the Ukrainian side of the border around Kharkiv, and that if this operation proceeded far enough, it could threaten those sufficiently to cause them to draw back. It doesn't seem likely that Kursk itself, or for example, Kursk nuclear power station, are the targets, because some of those are 50 kilometers or more in. And that would be quite risky to insert Ukrainian forces and then try and sustain them inside Russian territory in the face of an inevitable Russia counterattack. But politically and presentationally, there's a couple of potential big wins here, depending on how this goes. And that's, first of all, a boost to Ukrainian morale, given that they've had quite a difficult year, and also showing to international backers that the Ukrainians are still in the fight. And that's particularly important with the US elections coming up.
Yeah, because as one national broadcaster in the UK said, Ukraine's back in the news.
Yes, and I think that there's a degree to which, if this captures headlines, embarrasses Putin, embarrasses the Russians, it somewhat reverses the narrative of what has been probably 6 months of very slow Russian gains. Although it's worth noting, at the moment, there are no signs that the Russians are having to divert forces from in or around the Donbass. And that situation there, particularly around Chasiv Yar and heading towards Pokrovsk, remains quite delicate and dangerous for the Ukrainians.
That's really interesting because those places you talk about are a long way from where this is happening in the Donbass. New York as well, Toretsk. Is it like you say there's no sign that Russian forces are having to be diverted? So do you think there is likely to be no impact of this invasion, either in the Ukraine's ability to defend there, or Russia's ability to continue its slow attritional advances?
Yes, I mean the Russians. I mean, this all assumes that the Russians are effectively coordinating well, and it's worth noting that they seem to have been caught on the hop here. That goes some way to suggesting that the Ukrainians have addressed some of the problems that they've had in operational security over the past 12 months. But the Russians should have sufficient reserves and forces to move those into the area to meet this raid. And in theory, it shouldn't affect what's happening further south, which remains their main objective and their main thrust. But of course, actually, over time, the Russians have shown both that their coordination of large operational forces has been far from perfect. A lot of what they're doing has been as a product of, if you like, brute force or massed numbers. And in terms of defenses in and around Russia, for example, air defenses, they have shown that they're under pressure there, given the losses that they're suffering all the way along the front line. And so one of the reasons that the Ukrainians continue to conduct some of those deep strike operations that they use drones for is that they can attack Crimea. They attack out to the east of Ukraine, as we've seen another airbase hit in the past week, and they attack deep into Russia, because that, in terms of air defense systems and forces behind the front lines, does pose some challenges to the Russians about where they place them.
And how were they able to catch the Russians on the hop here in Kursk?
So in this respect, that's I mean we don't know at the moment, but that's an interesting area to delve into, perhaps some retrospective analysis of what was visible and what could be inferred from that. Because up until now, what we've been seeing is actually an increase in the level of surveillance that is possible over the battlefield. The Russians in particular have got a lot of small surveillance drones, and they have the upper hand at the moment in terms of what we call the transparency of the battlefield. And that's down to the fact that they are able to put so many over the battlefield that the Ukrainians are having to face difficult decisions about where and how they use their own ground-based air defenses. A lot of the really big systems with long ranges are needed to protect critical infrastructure and cities like Kyiv. And also it would be too expensive to use Patriots to take down medium-sized surveillance drones, let alone the very small loitering ones that the Russians use.
And in this attack, they are using highly mobile mechanized forces, a surprise, as we talked about, backed up with significant air defenses. The Institute for the Study of War, in its assessment on the 7th of August, it points to geolocated footage of the 6th and 7th, showing Ukrainian armored vehicles advancing about 10 kilometers from the international border, with Ukrainian forces penetrating at least 2 Russian defensive lines and a stronghold. What can you tell us about the direction of the attack and why they've managed to cross and how they've managed to cross those defensive lines with apparent ease?
Well, I mean, it looks like they may have gone even further in overnight. So we're now looking at maybe 15 kilometers in some directions. It does appear in part that this has been a more lightly defended and more static part of the line, and so rather than facing the kind of heavy Russian defences, significant minefields, significant fortifications with lots of artillery cover that we saw further to the south and to the east, they only faced, in the first instance, border guards and maybe sort of FSB ground forces rather than large conventional forces. I think there's an open question, maybe a bit too soon, to work out whether that is as a consequence of Russian complacency or maybe Ukrainian deception in terms of how they built up these forces. Possibly the Russians simply didn't expect it because the pressure that they're placing elsewhere and the fact that the Ukrainians, for their part, have had to rush forces around Kharkiv to deal with that buffer zone operation, which in itself has basically stalled. I mean, that's a good example of where the Ukrainian ability to use some Western supplied weapons over the border has now had an impact on Russian forces, and they've basically stemmed that advance and begun to turn it back.
If it is true that tanks are being used that have been supplied by NATO allies, armoured fighting vehicles as well, what do you read into the consequences politically of that, if that is the case, used in this invasion?
So there's certainly been some images of at least infantry fighting vehicles, so things like Strikers. I think some of the German armoured vehicles have been seen as well. In some respects, what this does is expose some of the rhetoric that the Russians have used in the past about threats to Russian territory, which is that they haven't essentially gone over the top in terms of their initial reaction. Indeed, they still seem to be absorbing the operation to a certain degree. I think when the US in particular freed up its restrictions on artillery, both barrel, tube artillery, and some of the rocket artillery, what it was doing was reflecting the fact that that those weapons are being used to attack Russian forces in the close battle along the front line elsewhere in Ukraine, and that what was happening around Kharkiv was simply the same kind of battle, but it just so happened to straddle the international border. In essence, this is an extension of that. It's a conventional, relatively close range fight that just so happens to have the international border in the way. It's not clear whether the longer range weapons, cruise missiles like Storm Shadow or the US supplied ballistic missile ATACMS, would be usable in this struggle. But I think there's definitely an argument that we made by some that the fact that this battle rages backwards and forwards demonstrates that fears of Russian escalation, whilst they should be taken seriously, are somewhat overblown in and around that close fight.
How long do you think it's going to be before it becomes apparent how long this advance is going to last? How long is it going to take before we actually get a better picture of what's really going on?
So a lot of that depends on, in essence, both the objectives and the speed at which the Russians muster an effective defense. Because you could see what was always intended to be something quite limited extend in duration if it turns out the Russians don't muster an effective defense. And then what happens is there's a significant opportunity here for the Ukrainians to effectively take more territory. I think the danger there is that sounds quite tempting, but if they haven't got the reserves or the ability to then stabilize a strong defensive position, what they'll have done is taken some quality forces, pushed them over the border, and then potentially overextended. So maybe another 48 or 72 hours, we'll have a good idea of the Russian response, and we might see Ukrainian consolidation and reserves moving up. I mean, some of that is the indications that we might see. Although if they've practiced effective camouflage and deception up until this point, they might be able to sort of hide that follow-up as well.
And do you think the Ukrainians actually have the forces to hold the ground?
I mean, it's always a bit difficult to sort of second guess them from 1,000 miles away. But the general view has been there is a manpower challenge for the Ukrainians with the current front lines. So the mobilization that they've taken place, the change in the conscription age, and the need to rebuild large, well-equipped counteroffensive forces for next year mean that you're unlikely to see a significant counteroffensive this year. And I should note, this isn't a significant counteroffensive, but it is a spoiler in Russian plans. So if you accept all of that's true, there is a risk here that the extension of the front lines in this way is not sustainable. And I think a lot of people would be concerned if the Ukrainians tried to do that. I mean, we've been wrong before, and so there's a note of caution in here. But generally, the view has been that no, they don't have the forces right now at the requisite level of quality and training and equipment to push that forward. It's worth noting, for example, that they would be well beyond the range of some of their longer range air defenses, which would be necessary to protect them against incoming Russian aircraft who could begin to pummel them with glide bombs of the kind that were used when the Kharkiv operation started. And they appear to have pushed up quite successfully their own FPV drones and smaller drones to strike Russian ground forces, and indeed some Russian helicopters, for example, that we've seen. But there is a genuine concern over whether or not they have enough of a defensive bubble against those incoming Russian aircraft that would be used. And I think it would be an enormous risk to try and push forward, for example, the F16s that have just arrived in country this far into Russia to defend them.
Yeah, I was asking a little bit about their ability to hold the ground, because one of the theories that had been told to me by one of the reporters from the Times is that Ukrainian, his sources were saying, Maxim Turker's sources were saying that Ukrainians have very firmly got their eyes on the US elections, and that would be of interest is to take and hold as much ground as possible in anticipation, because they are convinced, or the ones that he's spoken to, that Donald Trump will be the next president, and there will be some kind of peace deal that may be forced upon. And this is a race against time to reset the boundaries, if, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. I mean, it would be a bold gambit if that were true, given how far in advance we are of a potential Trump presidency. Even if he were to win the election, we're talking another 5 months before he would be in position. And so a Ukrainian operation launched now to capture as much ground as possible, to potentially trade it back for example, bits of the Donbass, that would require quite considerable reinforcement. And up until now, the Ukrainian modus operandi on the ground has been to ensure that the exchange rate of losses is as unfavorable to Russia as possible. I mean, Russia's been essentially doing that itself with how it's been advancing at the moment, but they can take those losses for some months yet, whereas the Ukrainians can't. So I wouldn't rule out essentially a gambit to seize territory that could later be traded away. But it's going to be a tall order to consolidate and hold it throughout the winter to be in a position to affect those later negotiations.
If we could just talk a little bit now about some of the successes that Ukrainian forces have had with their drones in recent days. This offensive included a reported first-person view FPV drone strike, bringing down a Russian Mi-28 attack helicopter, according to a source in the Ukrainian SBU security services. What does that tell us about the evolving capabilities of the Ukrainian drone operators?
So I think we've seen some interesting, if you like, aerial combat or less aerial combat, but aerial use of drones on both sides. So we've seen those images. I think the first of essentially an FPV drone bringing down a helicopter in flight. We're also seeing an increasing number of examples of both sides using FPV and other kind of loitering munitions against each other's drones. And so, for example, there's been a recent spate of some of the Ukrainian drones that, if you like, drop weapons on Russian forces. There's video of them being struck by Russian loitering munitions and drones. I think it's another example of the both the proliferation of different types and more proficient use by the operators in those drones to an extent that would probably overmatch anything that you say the UK has got at the moment. Like the experience that is being built up amongst drone operators on both sides in essentially using small racing drones or modified commercial drones to strike moving military targets is pretty impressive. It does also show that there is still this background electronic warfare battle going on. So various drone types have come into use and then been jammed or rendered obsolete. If the Ukrainians have advanced this far into Russia and are using their FPV drones on Russian territory, they've clearly found some way to counter local Russian jamming and electronic warfare.
I'm also really interested to hear your take on the attack, which you mentioned briefly earlier, on the airfield, the Morozovsk in the Rostov Oblast. It was an audacious attack, and although it has been attacked before, it's the extent of the attack and the damage that's done that's interesting in this particular attack. What can you tell us about the growing sense of confidence and capability there?
So I think this goes to the heart of there's both a big picture value in these as well as the tactical one. The big picture is that this is the other way that the Ukrainians have been keeping the Russians on the back foot and demonstrating that they have got an ability to reach out and hit Russia where it hurts. So some of the stuff that's been closest to the front line has been ammunition supply depots, some of the fuel or rail depots where supplies get moved into Russian forces, but also Russian infrastructure and deeper targets, and striking the air bases. And they've gone extremely far north. We're talking over 1,000 kilometers in some cases to hit large Russian bomber bases. That is both about keeping the Russians aware that the war can come home to them. But that is also about trying to do something about the Russian air campaign aimed at Ukrainian infrastructure, as well as their ground forces, because they have obviously got Patriot and Iris-T and other systems provided by the West. But the cheapest way of dealing with those Russian air threats is to destroy the aircraft on the ground before they take off. So destroying a target like that, and it does appear that they cause significant damage to both ammunition supply and aircraft parked on the ground, is really of benefit both presentationally and in terms of the conduct of the war. And it's also worth noting that they do this in various directions, because what you've got there is turning the length of the front into a disadvantage for the Russians, which is that they've now got to think about where they place their air defense systems across an enormous frontage, because effectively, although ground forces can't get there, the Russians are now having to assume that almost anything that's within, say, 1,000 miles of the Ukrainian front line in all directions could be a target for drones.
If we could just return to the invasion in the Kursk Oblast, President Putin's response was very quick, notably quick. Do you think that this has unnerved him? Do you think there's a bit of a panic going on in the Kremlin?
I mean, I don't really know what unnerves Putin, but it will certainly be uncomfortable to the military leadership, because in essence, their narrative has been, constant progress, limited threats, and the Ukrainians essentially are the ones who should be suing for peace and accepting terms that are put onto them. And I think this will induce a little bit of doubt in the minds of some, as well as just frankly embarrassing the system. And there are some movements going on behind the scenes at the moment where we're beginning to see military officers moved around, officials being picked up for corruption. I think there is unease in the Russian military system as to how effective they are. And even if this is a time-limited operation, the fact that they were able to move across the border, threaten a major area, do so publicly, capture Russian soldiers, it will just create, again, additional doubt in the Russian mind. I mean, I think it's worth going back to the Wagner insurrection. The general view is that when that took place, if Prigozhin and the lead elements of that force had pressed on, having bypassed most of the ground forces and the kind of deals that they had made, it was eminently possible for them to drive almost to Moscow unchallenged. Now, no one's suggesting that this is a Ukrainian ground operation that could conduct a similar penetration, but it does just create a little bit of concern in Russian military planners about exactly how deep their defenses are and where their vulnerabilities are. So I think, it does feel very strongly like this operation might be more significant politically and in kind of presentational terms and changing the narrative than it will be necessarily tactically, notwithstanding, as I said, we don't know how this will play out. And we could be looking back in a month at a limited operation and saying how audacious and successful it was. Similarly, we might look back and the Ukrainians might have got themselves tangled up in something that causes them to take additional losses that they really needed for next year.
So just finally, what will you be looking for in the coming hours and days?
So I think there's a question about how reserves are moved. I think there will be a question of the extent to which the Russian Air Force is involved in suppressing these ground forces. And I think there will be some interest in whether the Ukrainians move up more forces to consolidate, particularly on some of the higher ground, or bring up artillery to strike into, for example, some of the supply lines and routes that they might be able to cover. As I said, I think there is concern about whether the Ukrainians have enough to consolidate in strength. But you would expect to see there are some excellent analysts out there picking out signs of some of their additional artillery forces moving up, and whether or not they begin to dig in and consolidate.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting offensive by the Ukrainians. It's the first time that Ukraine's regular armed forces have crossed the borders. Previously, it's been special forces, it's been pro-Ukrainian Russian partisans that have crossed the border in limited raids. Now we see what looks like a mechanized brigade with engineering equipment crossing the border, supported by perhaps as many as 3 other brigades. Attacking and they're taking large numbers of Russian prisoners of war, so they've got the capacity to do that and bring them back. And they're obviously determined to press on. It's a very interesting, moving situation. We'll see, how ambitious this operation is, whether they intend to take and hold areas of land in a bid to divert Russian reserves from the Donbass area to the northern theatre, whether this is a serious attempt to hold on to Russian land ahead of any ceasefire discussions or negotiations, which would give them an opportunity to exchange for some of the Ukrainian land that's been taken by the Russians. So we're watching this very carefully, but it does look like a very serious commitment by the Ukrainians, a mechanized brigade across the border into Russia and quite close to a Russian nuclear power station as well.
And just briefly, what are your Ukrainian contacts telling you about this?
Well, they all say the commanders are keeping very quiet about what the true objectives are for this operation, but people are obviously speculating. I mean, Ukrainians are convinced that Donald Trump will win the US presidency, and they will be forced to negotiate on unfavorable terms. The Russians have the advantage on the battlefield now. They have the initiative, and the Ukrainians are trying to turn that around and make sure that they have a stronger position if they are forced to go to the negotiating table in November.
As I said earlier, you just returned from Ukraine. You've been in the Donbass region where some of the most intense fighting has been taking place. Can you just give us a brief overview of where you went and what the situation was?
So I was in Turetsk, or near Turetsk, on the outskirts of Turetsk, and Hrodivka, near Pokrovsk, on the front line in the Pokrovsk direction. And these are 2 cities, Pokrovsk and Turetsk, which are under intense bombardment and the subject of assaults by Russian infantry. The Donbass situation is not going well for the Ukrainians at the moment. The Russians have been able to advance pretty rapidly in the last couple of months, despite very, very hot temperatures and very difficult fighting conditions. They've thrown manpower into the battle, and they have made several kilometers. And Pokrovsk is a very key, very important garrison town for the Ukrainians. Turetsk is a city that's almost been obliterated, but it's still important to hold on to for the Ukrainians. And they want to make sure they hold Turetsk so that Konstantinivka, which is to the north of Turetsk, and a really important road and rail junction, is not threatened, is not flanked by a Russian movement. But they are under serious pressure because they don't have very many reserves at this point. The Ukrainians have spread very thin. Their infantry has been really taken a lot of casualties. It's also, people just are tired and they have to come back from the line for rest and because they're sick or to care for parents or something like this. So they are really struggling in this situation to hold such a long front line with the Russians. And that is why the Russians are able to make these incremental advances. So I was with a drone battalion that were trying to defend Turetsk, and I was with the 47th Brigade, who have very advanced American equipment, including Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, who are trying to hold the line at Pokrovsk.
And can we just have a little look? I mean, you've got footage, haven't you, of that work with the UAVs and how they're trying to hold those defensive lines. First of all, where did you go exactly to see what they were doing?
Well, I was at a command center with the UAV battalion. I can't say exactly where that is because obviously they're operational security reasons. But they are slightly set back from the very front line, but they're sending their drones forward to reconnoiter where the Russians are advancing. And what the tactics the Russians were employing at this time is to try and infiltrate Ukrainian positions with 3 or 4 soldiers, and then join as a big group to attack when they have more forces.
Let's just have a look at some of that footage then, and maybe you could talk us through it, because you were seeing this as it was happening, weren't you?
Yeah, I was in the command center watching the feeds with the commander, the major, as it happened. So this is one of the small groups of Russian infantry who are trying to infiltrate Ukrainian positions. So we saw them moving in groups of 3 or 4, trying to get into Ukrainian positions undetected. This group had been already targeted by FPV drones, and they were fleeing a house that had been struck by FPV drones repeatedly and a mortar until it was set fire, and they were trying to creep into the woods and get to another intact house where they could take cover. And you can see this is the house that they took cover in, but obviously the Ukrainians could follow them on the drone feed, and they continued to hit them. And this time it was being struck by a 122 millimeter artillery piece. And the Ukrainians don't know when they strike these positions, if they're in a house, what the success has been of that strike. So they just keep hitting the house until it either is burnt down or the Russians flee and go somewhere else. So it's a real game of cat and mouse, because they're watching these positions for sometimes hours on to see if the Russians are dead or alive, or if they try and come out and sneak out. They're using all the hedgerows, all the foliage that they can to try and avoid. This is another Russian position which is being hit by FPVs. And what the Russians are trying to do is they're trying to sneak into some of these buildings, and they stay there, 3 or 4 of them, and then another group of 3 or 4 will try and go, and they'll try and mass in a particular place until there's enough of them, perhaps platoon or company strength, to then attack a fortified Ukrainian position.
And so they're literally picking off Russian troops in support of infantrymen, 100 meters away or so. Is that right?
Right, so the Ukrainian infantry are in other houses or other basements around these positions, and the Russians are trying to find a weak point that they can get in. And so sometimes the infantry are pushing the Russians into a particular building, and then calling in the FPV strikes. So we're sitting there, and you can hear the FPV drone pilots calling in what they see on their drones, and then the major will he'll look at a particular drone feed. He has several drone feeds to choose from on his screen. We're just seeing one of them here, but there's a big bank of monitors with different drone feeds on it. He'll pick up one that's particularly interesting, then issue commands as to whether to launch FPV drone strikes against a particular target. And they have a threshold for doing that as well, where they probably won't launch an FPV strike against one soldier, but if there's 3 or 4, then they'll definitely start trying to take them out.
You also met with the 32nd's deputy commander. What did he have to say about the situation on the battlefield, and especially about how the Ukrainian government is handling recruitment at the moment?
So the 32nd Brigade had been brought in to try and hold the line around Toretsk, because before it had been held mostly by territorial defense and another brigade that was tired. And when that brigade withdrew, it created a weakness in that sector that the Russians were able to exploit. The Russians are fighting much smarter now. They're exploiting positions where there are weaker Ukrainian units rather than weaker fortifications. They're not looking at the fortifications, they're looking at the units and attacking those. And that's allowing them to flank stronger units with some success. And what this the Lieutenant Colonel said to me is that he was frustrated with the Ukrainian government because they hadn't mobilized troops quick enough, and they weren't mobilizing them successfully enough and in the wrong way. Because he felt that the message that was getting out to Ukrainian society is that we need more troops because there are so many casualties. And he said that, look, it's not the case that everyone that comes to the front line is dying. During a campaign, 5 to 7 people might die, 20 to 30 might get injured, which ranges from serious injuries to very light injuries, but they need to go to hospital. And then others might withdraw from the front because they're sick or they're unhealthy, because they spent so long at the front eating unhealthy foods or drinking energy drinks all the time, which is what the soldiers there do. and they simply need a break. And so he wants the messaging of the Ukrainian government to change, to say, look, there's so many soldiers who've been fighting now for 2.5 years. It's your duty to go forward and to take up positions just to give these guys a break. But instead, the messaging seems to be that we don't have enough people because our casualties are so severe, or there is no messaging to counter that information. And so he's very frustrated that the motivation isn't there from Ukrainians. There's just a fear. There's just a tactic of fear to try and coerce people to go to the front, round them up, and not inspire them positively, but just terrorize them into joining.
And of the troops that you met that were there, did you feel that they wanted to be there? They hadn't been coerced, as you were saying, that he was thinking that he was fearing? I mean, did you feel that they had a strong sense of moral courage and reason to be there?
I think the troops that we spoke to did feel like that, but it's always a difficult one because you're speaking to troops that agree to give you an interview. So people that will give you an interview are more likely to be motivated. They want the world to understand what they're doing. So it's a kind of self-selecting process really there.
Really interested to also hear about your time in Hrovdivka. Can you tell me a bit more about what you did there?
So I was spending time with the 47th Brigade. It's this brigade that's very well equipped with US Abrams tanks and Bradleys. And they've been brought in to try and hold the line around Pokrovsk. They've been in some of the fiercest fighting. They were the spearhead of the summer counteroffensive. And then they were brought in to try and hold lines at Avdiivka. So they've taken very heavy casualties, but they're still being used because they have these very effective fighting vehicles, the Bradleys. And the Bradleys have proved to be very resistant even to drone strikes. They have a very effective gun, the Bushmaster cannon, which is very good at clearing Russian positions and making short work of any Russian armored fighting vehicles that they come up against. So they have been thrown into battle time and time again in some of the most difficult places.
I was just going to say to you, I mean, they always want more, and I think you wrote in your dispatch that they want more of these combat vehicles. How are they actually using them with their sparse resources as they see it?
So the way that they use these fighting vehicles has changed, I think, from the way that the Bradleys were envisioned to be used. But they are basically waiting until there is a large target of opportunity. Maybe it's a tank, maybe it's a Russian fighting vehicle, or maybe it's a Ukrainian position that's about to be overrun. And then they're called in from a distance by a commander using a drone feed, guided using a drone feed, to the extent almost like you're playing a computer going left and right, and the driver just follows the instructions. And then they fire at the target that they're given by the commander. It's not really engaging targets of opportunity. It's very specific, kind of a fire mission almost, that they're told to go on. Their fire is corrected by commanders using drones, and then they have to pull back very quickly because they are a priority target for Russian drones and artillery attack.
It's hotly contested, this part of the Donbass, isn't it? How effective are these vehicles proving?
So they're saving a lot of lives, and the Ukrainians really like them. They're very happy with these vehicles because lots of the vehicles will get hit 4, 5, 6 times, and they'll still be able to drive out of there. Or even if they have to drive some distance on fire and then evacuate the troops, they're able to do that. And most of the troops inside will be alive. So the crews that drive them credit them with saving lots of lives. They also say the weapon, the Bushmaster cannon, is incredibly effective at piercing Russian armor and making short work of Russian infantry that are coming towards them. So they're really, really keen on them. And they say that actually the armor of the Bradleys, the reactive explosive armor, is better even than the US Abrams, which have had a lot of problems with the kind of new form of warfare and Russian drone attacks.
That's fascinating. Last time I spoke to you, you'd been in the Kharkiv region, and I was just wondering if you were able to catch up with any of your contacts there and get an idea of what's going on.
So it looks like the Kharkiv region is, from a Ukrainian perspective, more or less stable, but the Ukrainians have had to throw in a lot of troops and a lot of equipment, and a lot of their ammunition supplies have gone in the Kharkiv direction to try and push the Russians back away from Kharkiv. It's such an important city, a city of 1.5 million people. And they have driven, you can see on some of the maps that are produced, they have driven the Russians back from Lipsy, which is this really key area. If the Russians had got into Lipsy, they could have used those heights to bring barrel artillery to bear on the city itself. And they haven't gotten there, and even in Vovchansk, the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back from certain areas and even perhaps encircle some Russian units who are stuck in Vovchansk there. The fighting is still very fierce in that area, but it doesn't look like the Russians are able to advance there. They've ground to a halt, really.
And how does your experience of the front line this time compare to what you experienced and saw in Vovchansk and Lipsy?
It's a different situation, I think, because it's at Lipsy and Vovchansk the situation was very dynamic. The Russians were moving forward. It was always a bit worrying when you going somewhere with a Ukrainian unit because you didn't know where the lines were going to change. And we were in that foxhole where the Russians ended up being within automatic weapons range. You could hear the automatic weapons, which is not a place you really want to be. Whereas in the Donbass, they are pushing forward, but it's attrition. So you can see that they're trying to creep forward, and they do get strongholds, and they use their manpower advantage to get forward, and they are advancing rapidly, relatively rapidly. It's kind of 10 kilometers in 2 weeks, which is significant given the pace of this war normally. But you be able to tell that the Russians are coming, they're driving forward, and you'll be able to be in quite a stable place. You won't be in danger of being overrun when you go to visit a frontline position.
And during this reporting trip, you wrote a dispatch, very interesting dispatch about Ukraine's partisans and in particular the resistance movement in Crimea. Can you tell us who they are exactly?
So this is a group called Atesh, which in Crimean Tatar means fire. And they are a resistance movement primarily in Crimea, but also they've employed some people in Russia itself. And they have a mix of motivations. So there is a strong Crimean Tatar community, or at least there was prior to occupation in Crimea, and they have traditionally resisted the Russian occupation. Stalin deported hundreds of thousands of Tatars from Crimea, and they have this kind of historic memory of this behavior by the Russians. So they have been attacking Putin's railway, which he wants to build to create a land bridge from Russia all the way through occupied south of Ukraine to Crimea and replace the Kerch Bridge as the main supply route into Crimea. And they're trying to kind of foil this effort by blowing up sections of track and burning relay boxes. They also use cash payments to recruit Russians who might be already disgruntled with the Kremlin. And this is a big part of their recruitment campaign. Their posters always have someone handing out tons of cash. So it's offering cash reward if you're willing to do something against the Russian state.
How difficult was it to make contact with them?
It's pretty difficult, although all of these operations have a kind of information operations element to them. So they have a Telegram channel, and that's partly how they recruit new members. They try and do as much of this online as possible, so they don't expose their operatives, their agents, to the risk of a face-to-face meeting when they know the FSB are trying to infiltrate their group. So we had to write to the Telegram channel that they were operating, and then we had to verify them with Ukraine's military intelligence to make sure this was the real Telegram channel, because there's also the FSB have set up a fake Telegram channel in order to try and lure unsuspecting Ukrainians or Crimean Tatars or Russians into communicating with the FSB and demonstrating their sympathy for a partisan movement.
So you're telling me about how they're trying to sabotage the Russian war effort by attacking the railway links. Can you? And there's one person in particular who you wrote about and you feature. Can you tell me a little bit more about this saboteur?
So there was a young lad who's actually Russian, who was sabotaging areas of the rail inside Russia, inside the Rostov region, and he was setting fire to relay boxes, and he'd been recruited quite recently by Atesh, and he told about his experience and how nerve-wracking it is, because he knew that if the FSB caught him, it wasn't a question of how many years in jail he faced, but how badly he'd be tortured and if he'd just be disappeared altogether, because this is kind of Putin's personal project. This great railroad that will secure the future of Crimea is something Putin is very carefully invested in, and he has announced it himself in March this year. So he was talking about the worry that he had even to do this kind of relatively minor act of sabotage, which is basically getting together an explosive liquid, pouring it onto a relay box and setting fire to it, which is still very disruptive to the Russians. In doing so, he went to reconnoiter the route several times, and he actually, in order to kind of bolster his courage, I think, and also to give him some cover, he went on a date. He organized a date, and he said he was going to visit this girl, and then during their walks, he would look at the relay boxes and figure out how the best way to get there and get back was without being caught. And she didn't know anything about his mission, his real objective. But he thought if he was captured, he could say, look, I just went to this area because I was going for a walk with my date.
And what was his motivation to take such risks?
So he said he was frustrated with how many people in his area were coming back from the front. They were coming back from the front line either as alcoholics because they're so traumatized by what they've been through, or as he said, cripples because they've been injured by the fighting. And he didn't want to become one of those people, and he thought that he might well be pressed into going to the front himself anyway, and he wanted to take some kind of almost a preemptive revenge on the Russian state for doing this to his community and potentially doing it to him as well.
You mentioned earlier the kind of the fake telegram channels that the Russians have taken up to try, the FSB has taken up to set up to try and catch people. What other measures are they taking to try and thwart this?
So the Russians have tried to fortify this area of railway. They put up defensive. There's armored vehicle patrols. There's lots of surveillance cameras. They've got patrols regularly going, infantry patrols regularly going up and along the lines, and they're trying to. Whenever there is a sabotage attack, they go into the villages nearby and basically turn the villages inside out to try and find out if there are any partisan sympathizers there. They go into houses, they check people's phones, they search houses, and some of the villages, if they suspect them, they've basically disappeared, and we're not really sure what happens to them after that.
And also fake partisans they have as well?
So yeah, the FSB have been so desperate to infiltrate this movement that they have put forward people who would offer themselves as partisans in order to kind of win the trust of the Atesh coordinators. And Atesh have very successfully exploited this, and they've persuaded some of the Russian FSB agents who they say they identify with the help of Ukrainian intelligence. And once they identify them, they ask them to do tasks for them as if they were a genuine partisan. And they say they have persuaded some FSB operatives to do things such as setting recruitment centers on fire with Molotov cocktails in order to prove their loyalty to the partisan movement.
Maxim, you have only just got back, but a lot's happened also since you got back. And I'm guessing if you're in the country, you might be heading up to Sumy right now. Can you tell me, when you sort of take a step back, what your takeaways are from this trip and what's been happening in recent days?
Sure. Well, I think the situation in the Donbass is pretty dire for the Ukrainians. They're being pushed back, and the weakness in terms of manpower is being exploited. Now, the Ukrainians are always taking a really big gamble in pushing their forces across the border from Sumy into Russia. You know, those are forces that could be used to bolster forces in the Donbass, and I think they're taking a gamble that they can preempt the possible Russian attack on Sumy, which is just across the border. It's a major city for Ukraine. And they can also divert some of those Russian forces from the Donbass north. Or maybe if the Russians don't divert resources, they will continue with a very ambitious operation to take and hold territory inside Russia that will be useful if they are forced to go to the negotiating table by a possible Trump presidency in November. They can offer that the land that they've taken in exchange for some of the recent gains made by Russia.
Maxim Tucker, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.